The numbers weren't just insulting, they were proof. I was halfway through my second coffee when Kyle from HR sent out an email titled Updated Staff Compensation Review. I clicked it without thinking, assuming it was some standard policy memo. Instead, a spreadsheet loaded on my screen, names, positions, and salaries of every manager, analyst, and coordinator in the department. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. Then my eyes locked on the numbers. Mason Reeves, $135,000. Vanessa Lynn, $138,500. Tristan Adler, $142,800. My stomach tightened as I scrolled down the list. I trained every one of them. I'd been with the company almost a decade. My salary? $78,800. I felt the heat crawl up my neck. Is this real? I clicked through the tabs, hoping maybe it was a budget projection, not actual pay. But no, this was current as of last month. My name sat there like a neon sign, $40,000 below the people who asked me how to run the same systems I built. My first instinct was disbelief. Maybe there was some logical reason. Maybe my bonus structure was different, or some technicality in the data. But the more I looked, the more I realized there was no mistake. They just didn't value me. I thought about the past 9 years, late nights, missed weekends, every infrastructure upgrade I'd led, the systems they relied on daily, my code, my documentation, my work. My hand tightened on the mouse. I scrolled back to Mason's line. Mason, who I'd trained when he couldn't even navigate the internal dashboards. Mason, who once asked me if a pivot table was a special kind of graph. Mason made $37,000 more than me. That's when my jaw set. A dull, slow anger started burning in my chest. Not the kind you yell about, but the kind that makes everything crystal clear. 3 minutes later, a second email came from Kyle. Subject line, recall, updated staff compensation review. Too late. 2. By the time I read the recall notice, I had already dragged the file into a flash drive I kept in my drawer, a habit from years of archiving my own work, just in case someone lost it during audits. I ejected the drive and slid it back into the bottom corner of my desk. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't just the number that got to me. It was what it meant. It was proof that to them, I was just background noise. A safe bet who didn't need to be rewarded because I'd never made trouble. I was wrong. The rest of the morning blurred. Meetings came and went, voices droning on about quarterly targets while my mind replayed those numbers over and over. $97,800. Not terrible, not great, but humiliating when you realize you'd built the foundation for people who were now cashing in on your work. By lunchtime, I'd stopped being shocked. Now I was just clear-headed, calm almost. The kind of calm that meant something was about to change. When I shut down my laptop at 5 Ostu, I glanced at the flash drive one more time, a small piece of metal and plastic. But it felt heavier than anything on my desk. I wasn't the lowest earner, but I was the lowest valued. I didn't knock, I didn't even pause to think about it. I walked straight into Daniel Hammond's office with the flash drive in my pocket and the spreadsheet open on my laptop. He was leaning back in his chair, scrolling through something on his phone. When he saw me, his expression barely changed, just that usual corporate half-smile he used whenever someone wanted something he didn't plan to give. "Got a minute?" I asked, though I wasn't really asking. Daniel lowered his phone and gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sure, what's up?" I set my laptop on his desk, turned it around, and tapped the screen. "How the hell does this happen?" His brow furrowed slightly as he leaned forward. The spreadsheet glowed back at both of us. Names, titles, salaries. I saw the moment he recognized it. His face didn't flinch, but his hand froze just long enough to tell me he knew exactly what I was looking at. "Where'd you get that?" he asked carefully. "Kyle's email," I said. "The one he recalled too late. Doesn't matter where it came from. What matters is that Mason, Vanessa, and Tristan are all making over $130,000 while I'm stuck at 97. I trained them, Daniel. They're running on systems I built." Daniel's lips pressed together. He leaned back again, the picture of calm. "Market's changed since you were hired," he said smoothly. "We've had to adjust compensation to attract new talent. You know how it is." "Adjust?" I repeated. "By paying them $40,000 more than me? You've had almost a decade to adjust mine." He exhaled slowly, like he was already tired of the conversation. Look, it's not personal. HR has guidelines. If you want a comp review, you can file a request. I'm filing one now, I cut in. Daniel shook his head. It'll get denied. We just did reviews. There it was, the brick wall. No explanation beyond, that's how it is, like I was supposed to nod and walk out grateful for my scraps. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just stood up, closed my laptop, and said, then I'll take care of it myself. Daniel blinked. What's that supposed to mean? I didn't answer. I left his office without looking back. When I got to my desk, I unplugged my laptop, slid it into my bag, and clocked out. No dramatic exit. No slamming doors. Just a quiet, deliberate walk to the elevator. That night wasn't for rage. It was for planning. By the time I got home, I already knew what I was going to do. Not scream, not beg, not send angry emails. I was going to lay out every single piece of value I'd built for that company and make them see what they'd taken for granted. And if they still didn't see it, I'd make sure someone else would. I poured myself 2 fingers of cheap store-brand whiskey and sat down at my kitchen table. The spreadsheet from HR was still burned into my brain. Every number, every name. I didn't feel like screaming or throwing anything. I just felt done. Done waiting for someone to notice the years I'd given to that place. Done being the quiet workhorse. I opened my laptop and created a blank document. The title came to me instantly. What I've actually done here. The first line was simple. Year 1, 2015. I started listing everything I could remember. The finance dashboards I built from scratch because the old system was a mess of broken macros. The vendor audit that uncovered $87,000 in overcharges. The time I stayed 3 nights in the office during the data migration that everyone else said was impossible, but ended up saving the company from paying a consulting firm 6 figures. Then came year 2, year 3, year 4. I wrote it all down. The quarterly reconciliations I handled single-handedly when our team was short-staffed, the junior analysts I trained who went on to promotions, the dozens of process improvements that never made headlines but saved thousands every month. By midnight, I had 9 years mapped out in black and white, a career's worth of invisible wins that nobody seemed to remember but me. I opened a new section and titled it Annual Impact 2023. I went through the numbers, the spreadsheets, the audits, and added up the total savings I delivered over the past year alone. When I saw the final figure, $274,000, I stopped typing for a moment. It felt surreal. I had saved them almost 3 times my salary in 1 year, and yet they were handing raises to people who couldn't even format a pivot table without asking me how. I added the number to the last page, bold and underlined. Then I wrote, if I were a vendor delivering this level of savings, my contract would be worth far more than $97,800. The whiskey glass was empty by then, but I didn't care. I wasn't tired. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. I printed every page and fed the stack into my old binding machine, the kind with the plastic combs. It looked like something you'd see in a board meeting. Professional, clean, undeniable. On the cover, I printed in bold, 9 years of value, a report by my name. Then I pulled out the envelope I'd been holding onto for weeks. It was an offer letter from a competitor, a mid-sized firm led by Catherine Hayes, someone I'd met through a vendor negotiation years ago. Catherine had been persistent, reaching out a couple of months back, and her offer was solid. $144,000 base salary, full benefits, flexible remote policy. I'd told her I wasn't ready to leave. That was before I saw the spreadsheet. I printed a short resignation letter, direct, no drama, and tucked it inside the binder alongside Catherine's offer. At 6:45 a.m., I got dressed like it was any other day, shirt, tie, jacket. No one on my team would know anything was different. At 7 due, I drove to the office, the binder and envelope sitting on the passenger seat like silent weapons. I was one of the first to arrive. The CEO's office door was open. Garrett Wilson's desk was spotless, as usual. I walked in, placed the binder and envelope neatly on the center of his desk, and walked out without saying a word. By 7:15, I was back at my workstation, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. My plan wasn't to storm out. I didn't want to leave. I wanted them to see exactly who they'd misjudged. By 9:30 a.m., my inbox pinged with an urgent meeting invite. Garrett Wilson, our CEO, mandatory attendance. No subject line, just a time, now. When I walked into the executive conference room, it was already full. Garrett sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Daniel was 2 seats down, avoiding eye contact. Kyle from HR had a nervous smile plastered on his face, and next to him was Vanessa Chen, our COO, tapping her pen against a yellow legal pad. "Have a seat," Garrett said. The binder I'd left on his desk was open in front of him, a few pages dog-eared, my resignation letter tucked neatly under a paperweight. Catherine's offer letter was on top of the stack. Garrett's hand rested on it like it might explode. "We've been reviewing your report," he began. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Very thorough work." I nodded, but said nothing. "Let them talk first." Kyle cleared his throat. "I'll admit, it's one of the most comprehensive self-assessments I've ever seen. 9 years of contributions, detailed metrics. It's impressive." "Impressive," I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "That's a polite way of saying, we didn't realize how much we've been ignoring you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but Garrett cut in before anyone could respond. "We're not ignoring you. Compensation is complicated." "It's not that complicated," I said sharply. Mason Reeves, Vanessa Lynn, and Tristan Adler all make $35,000 to $45,000 more than me. I trained them. I built the systems they rely on. If this company can afford to overpay junior staff while underpaying the person who built the infrastructure, then compensation isn't complicated. It's mismanaged. Silence filled the room. Even Vanessa, who usually had something polished and corporate-ready to say, just looked down at her notepad. Garrett clasped his hands together. "We're not here to argue. We want to find a solution. What would it take for you to stay?" I could feel every eye in the room turn toward me. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the question hang. Then I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "Here's what it would take," I said, my voice steady. "A base salary of $150,000, a $40,000 bonus to account for the years of being underpaid, and a full compensation review for every department I've supported, so no one else has to fight for what they've earned." Kyle blinked like I'd just slapped him. Daniel's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. Garrett, however, just studied me, his eyes narrowing slightly like he was trying to read the angle of the move. "That's a bold ask," Garrett said finally. "It's not bold," I replied. "It's fair. I have an offer on the table for $144,000 with full benefits and leadership opportunities. If I walk, you'll be left with systems you don't fully understand and a team that doesn't know how to run them. I'm not saying this as a threat. It's just the truth." Vanessa set down her pen. "We need time to review this," she said, her tone calm but firm. 24 hours. "Fine," I said, but not a minute more. I stood up and pushed in my chair. None of them spoke as I left the room, binder pages still spread across the table. They thought this was about money, about me trying to squeeze a raise out of them. They were wrong. It was never just about the money. It was about respect, and I wasn't leaving the building without either getting it or walking away for good. The whispers started the second I stepped out of the conference room. People had noticed I'd been called upstairs. They saw me walk back in with that calm, steady look I get when I'm about to do something big. No one said anything to my face, but I could feel it. The sideways glances, the quiet conversations cut short when I walked by. I ignored them. I had something more important to do. Back at my desk, I plugged in the flash drive, not the one with the salary spreadsheet, but another one I kept buried at the bottom of my drawer, a plain black drive with no label. I'd been working on the files inside for 18 months, on and off, whenever I had a spare moment, not because I wanted to, but because something hadn't added up for a long time. It started with a line item. 14,800 vendor payment to Pinewood Ventures LLC. It wasn't on any approved vendor list. The P.O. box address looked fake, and the invoice reference number was missing standard formatting. At first, I assumed it was a typo or a one-off error. But when I dug deeper, I found quarterly payments to Pinewood Ventures, all for oddly rounded amounts, all just below the thresholds that would trigger our internal audit protocols. The pattern bothered me enough that I started tracking it, not just Pinewood Ventures, but half a dozen ghost vendors I found hidden across multiple accounts. The totals kept climbing. By the end of last quarter, I'd traced over $2.7 million siphoned off in small, quiet increments. Each payment looked innocent on its own, but together they painted a clear picture of deliberate fraud. I knew someone inside was behind it. I just didn't know who. Not yet. While the executives upstairs thought this was about my salary, I was sitting on the real reason Catherine Hayes from the competing firm had been calling me. She suspected something shady at my company long before I did. Her team had seen discrepancies when they reviewed shared vendor lists during a joint project. When she made me the offer at $144,000 base pay, I realized her interest wasn't just my skill set. She wanted the one guy who'd actually noticed the irregularities. My phone buzzed on the desk, a text from Catherine. "Did you do it?" I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "Yes." I opened the fraud file, a collection of spreadsheets, screenshots, email logs, and payment histories, all meticulously cross-referenced. It wasn't just numbers anymore. It was evidence, solid, undeniable, dangerous evidence. The numbers felt heavier than anything I'd built for them in 9 years. I could practically feel the tension in my shoulders as I scrolled through the last page, where I'd summarized the total siphoned amount, $2,784 to $320.15. The precision of it made me sick. This wasn't just about underpaying me. It wasn't even about neglect. It was about the company turning a blind eye while someone inside stole millions. I had brought small discrepancies up to Daniel months ago. He brushed me off, saying audits would take care of it. They didn't. He didn't even look at the files I sent. That's when I started saving everything to this flash drive, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment. Now I had leverage that went far beyond salary negotiations. Garrett and the board had no idea what kind of storm was brewing under their noses. I almost wanted to give them a chance to do the right thing. But after 9 years of being invisible, I wasn't sure they deserved that chance anymore. I closed the file, ejected the drive, and slid it back into my pocket. Whatever they decided in the next 24 hours, I knew one thing for sure. They thought I was just another disgruntled employee. They were wrong. 3 hours later, my name appeared in a new calendar invite. Executive meeting. Mandatory. No subject line again. Just the time and location. I already knew what this was about. The moment I stepped into the boardroom, I saw they'd stacked the deck differently this time. Garrett was there, as expected, with Daniel and Kyle. But now they'd added Thomas Whitaker, the company's top lawyer. His pinstripe suit looked like it cost more than my car. He didn't bother hiding the shark-like grin on his face. "Have a seat," Garrett said, motioning to the chair opposite him. I sat down, folding my hands calmly on the table. Thomas slid a folder toward me, his gold pen clipped neatly inside. "First, let me say," Garrett began, "your report really opened our eyes. We didn't realize how much of the company's backbone comes from your work." He gestured toward the folder. "We want to make this right." Kyle jumped in, his voice a little too upbeat. "We've approved a salary adjustment, $155,000, a $45,000 performance bonus, and," he paused dramatically, "we'd like to promote you to Executive Director of Finance Systems, full seat at the leadership table." It was everything I had asked for, and then some, but I wasn't naive enough to think this was generosity, not with Thomas Whitaker in the room. Thomas cleared his throat. "Of course, we'd need you to sign some standard documents, an updated contract, a non-disclosure agreement." He tapped the folder lightly with one manicured finger. "This is standard when someone joins the executive team." "Standard," I repeated, picking up the folder, but not opening it. "Yes," Thomas said smoothly. "This NDA just ensures you don't discuss internal compensation structures, company strategy, or any irregularities you might have encountered. We all know how rumors can hurt a business." I smiled, just barely. "Irregularities. That's a polite way to put it." Daniel's face twitched, but he stayed quiet. Garrett leaned forward, his tone fatherly now. "Look, we know there's been frustration, but we want to move forward. You've been here almost a decade. We don't want to lose you." I let the silence stretch. They were nervous. I could feel it. Before I sign anything, I said finally, I'll need to review the NDA with my own counsel. Thomas raised an eyebrow. It's a standard document. We can answer any questions right now. I'm sure you could, I replied, but I'll still need time. I don't sign anything blind. Garrett exhaled slowly, trying not to look irritated. Fine, we'll give you 48 hours. One more thing, I added, sliding the folder back toward them. I want written proof that all compensation discrepancies will be reviewed within 30 days. Not just mine, all of them. Kyle's fake smile faltered. That's a big ask. It's not an ask, I said flatly. It's my condition for even considering this. They exchanged glances like they were trying to telepathically decide who would object. Finally, Garrett gave a slow nod. We'll review that request. I stood, gathering my things. Good. Then I'll review your offer. As I walked out, I could feel Thomas's eyes drilling into my back. They thought they'd box me in with money and titles. They thought I'd take the bait. What they didn't know was that this wasn't about a paycheck anymore. The NDA wasn't there to protect salaries. It was there to bury the fraud. 2 weeks later, I walked back into the same boardroom where they'd tried to buy my silence. This time, I wasn't alone, at least not in spirit. I had a 15-page packet under my arm that was heavier than any title or bonus they could dangle in front of me. Garrett, Daniel, Kyle, and Vanessa were already seated, their polite smiles strained. Thomas Whitaker sat at the end of the table, his hands clasped on a leather folder, eyes sharp like he was preparing for battle. Glad you could join us, Garrett said, his tone clipped but trying to sound pleasant. Of course, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. This won't take long. The giant monitor on the wall flickered to life. Amara Jackson, the board chair, appeared via Zoom. She was all business, crisp white blouse, framed glasses, the kind of presence that could cut through a room even from behind a screen. Let's get this started, she said. I understand there have been some disagreements. Something like that, I said, pulling the packet from my folder. I placed one copy in front of each of them. What's this? Thomas asked, flipping open the first page. Evidence, I said calmly. Payment records for a shell company called Pinewood Ventures. Over $2.7 million paid out in small increments over the last year and a half, all tied to bogus vendor accounts, with P.O. boxes and no legitimate services rendered. The room went still. Kyle stopped pretending to smile. Vanessa's pen froze mid-tap. Garrett cleared his throat. What exactly are you implying? I looked straight at Thomas. I'm not implying anything. I'm showing you where the money went. And unless someone here wants to explain why Pinewood Ventures happens to be owned by a holding company connected to Thomas's brother-in-law, I'll assume I've already answered my own question. Thomas's jaw tightened. This is a serious accusation. You're overstepping. No, I said, cutting him off. What's serious is the fact that I flagged suspicious vendor activity to Daniel 6 months ago. He brushed it off. I documented every payment since then, and now I have a paper trail that points straight to you. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. I didn't think it was anything major, just small discrepancies. Small discrepancies? I snapped, my voice sharper now. $2.7 million isn't a small discrepancy, it's theft. Amara's face on the screen darkened. Thomas, is there any legitimate explanation for this? Thomas tried to hold her gaze. These documents could be fabricated. He's clearly disgruntled over compensation. I slid a USB drive across the table toward Garrett. Everything on those pages is backed by company ledger exports and time-stamped emails. Cross-check it. Call every vendor on that list. You'll find that Pinewood Ventures doesn't even have a phone line. The silence that followed was heavy. I didn't break it. Finally, Amara spoke again, her voice cool and cutting. Why bring this to us instead of going to the SEC? I leaned back, folding my arms. Because I still believed this company could be fixed. Until today. But watching Thomas sit here and pretend like I'm making it all up, I shook my head. That tells me exactly how deep this goes. For the first time, Garrett looked rattled. He glanced at Thomas, then back at the packet in front of him. We need to verify this information immediately. You should, I said, standing. But you don't have much time. Once the SEC gets wind of this, it won't just be an internal issue anymore. I gathered my things, leaving the USB drive on the table. You wanted to keep me quiet with a raise and a title. That was never going to work. My value isn't just in what I built here, it's in what I know, and I know exactly who's been bleeding this company dry. The room was dead silent as I walked out. For the first time, they weren't looking at me like I was replaceable. The next 24 hours were a storm I didn't have to stand in. I just watched it roll through. By 3 p.m., that day security had escorted Thomas Whitaker out of the building. He didn't say a word, didn't look at anyone, but the rumors spread faster than wildfire. People said he'd tried to argue with the board, that Amara Jackson had called him a liability right to his face. By 5 p.m., the official announcement came through. An independent audit was being launched immediately. The entire finance department went quiet. Nobody wanted to be the next one under the microscope. That night, while most people went home to pretend things were normal, I stayed late. I didn't need to. I just wanted to see what would happen. By midnight, 2 more people from accounting were escorted out, their desks cleared by HR staff who didn't make eye contact with anyone. I wasn't surprised. I'd suspected they were helping push through those fake vendor payments. The signs were all there if you knew where to look. Daniel, on the other hand, wasn't caught up in the fraud, just incompetence. He'd ignored my warnings about the irregularities, and now that oversight was pinned squarely on him. He didn't even try to argue when Garrett publicly labeled him asleep at the wheel in front of the board. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Garrett was scrambling. He'd tried to frame my report as a team effort, like the company had caught the fraud internally through due diligence. But I knew Amara wasn't buying it. When I walked past the conference room at 12:30 a.m., she was still on Zoom with Garrett, her voice sharp enough to carry through the glass wall. I heard the words liability, fallout, and legal exposure. Not exactly a friendly pep talk. At 1:17 a.m., I finally packed up and left. I wasn't sticking around to watch them try to clean up the mess I'd exposed. As I stepped out into the night air, I saw Catherine's car idling across the street. She rolled down the window, that familiar confident smirk on her face. "You ready?" she asked. I slid into the passenger seat and let out a slow breath. "I start in 3 weeks," I said. "But first, I'm taking a vacation." "Good," she said, handing me a paper cup of hot coffee. "You've earned it." As we drove off, I glanced back at the building, the pristine glass windows, the glowing company logo that suddenly looked hollow. Inside, they'd spend weeks trying to repair the damage, to bury the story before it reached the wrong ears. But I knew better. You can't patch a structure when the rot runs that deep. The best part? I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even satisfied. I was just calm. They were still spinning, and I was already gone. 2 days before my official start date with Catherine's firm, my phone rang. The caller ID made me pause. Garrett Wilson. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered. "Garrett," I said flatly. There was a long pause before he spoke. His voice had lost its usual corporate polish. "We're struggling with your systems," he admitted. "The audit team can't figure out the frameworks you built. We need help. Name your consulting rate, and we'll make it happen." I let that hang for a second, almost amused by how fast the tone had shifted. "My price?" I said. "My price was being treated fairly for 9 years. That offer's gone." "Don't do this," he said quickly. "Look, I know things got tense, but we can make this right. We'll pay whatever you want. Just help us stabilize before the board." I cut him off. "You want me to clean up the mess I warned you about for years? The systems I begged you to maintain? The people I trained who you chose to pay more than me? No, Garrett, I'm not saving you from yourselves." I could almost hear him grinding his teeth on the other end. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. The board is breathing down my neck. We're trying to keep the company afloat." "Then maybe you should have listened when I was in the building," I said, my tone icy. "Now, you'll have to figure it out without me." "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice tightening. "No," I replied, calm and certain. "The mistake was thinking I'd always be there to bail you out." Before he could say anything else, I hung up. Then I blocked his number. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the phone in my hand. I expected to feel some sense of victory, maybe even satisfaction. But all I felt was a strange, quiet relief. They finally realized what they'd lost, and I didn't care anymore. I turned off my phone, packed the last few boxes in my apartment, and started planning my first week at the new job. Garrett and his team could sink or swim without me. They'd learned the hard way what happens when you undervalue the person holding the foundation together. My first day at the new firm felt like stepping into a different world. Catherine met me in the lobby with a glass of champagne, not a contract. "Welcome to a company that actually values you," she said with a grin. I believed her. The office wasn't as flashy as my old one. Fewer glass walls, more open desks. A hum of collaboration instead of hushed whispers. There wasn't an ounce of corporate stiffness. People looked me in the eye, introduced themselves like they wanted me there. It was a small thing, but I noticed. By the end of the first week, I had already been asked for my thoughts on a new client strategy, not just as a number cruncher, but as someone whose experience mattered. They didn't just want me to maintain systems, they wanted me to build them. Catherine pulled me into her office on Friday. "We're going after your old firm's clients," she said. "Not to be petty, but because we can do better." I smiled. "Let's do it." 6 months later, we'd won 3 of those clients. Not because we undercut prices or played dirty, but because I implemented systems that actually made sense. Transparent audits, real-time reporting, and a pay structure for staff that rewarded effort instead of politics. People noticed. Catherine stopped by my desk one day holding a printout of client reviews. "You're not just a hire," she said. "You're a difference maker." Meanwhile, news about my old company trickled in like a slow-motion car crash. The fraud investigation hit the press. It turned out Thomas wasn't just skimming off Pinewood Ventures. There were multiple shell companies, multiple players. The story went public, and suddenly everyone wanted to know how $2.7 million slipped through the cracks. Garrett Wilson resigned under personal reasons, which everyone knew was code for "we forced him out." Daniel Hammond didn't fare much better. He was demoted to a consultant role, stripped of all authority, a scapegoat for his lack of oversight. The company limped along for a few months before being sold at a steep loss to a larger competitor. When I read the headline, "Finance Scandal Leads to Sale of Wilson & Co." at 40% below valuation, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt, right, like gravity had finally done its job. Catherine walked into my office with 2 coffees the morning that story broke. "You seeing this?" she asked, sliding one cup across my desk. "Yeah," I said, leaning back. "Took them long enough?" She smirked. "Funny thing is, they probably still don't understand why they failed." "I do," I said. "They never valued the people who held the place together." Over the next year, I doubled down on building systems here. Not just technical infrastructure, but a culture of fairness. I pushed for transparent salary reviews, mandatory fraud checks, and a mentorship program that actually recognized the people who did the hard work. Catherine backed me every step of the way, and it worked. 1 year after I started, our firm wasn't just thriving. It was winning over clients who'd once sworn loyalty to Wilson & Co. We became the company that did things differently, and people respected us for it. Looking back, I don't miss my old office, or the titles, or the paycheck games. What I do feel is a kind of quiet satisfaction. Justice didn't come in the form of revenge. It came from walking away and building something better. Because the truth was never going to stay buried. My silence was never going to protect them.